He told her that being a surgeon would ruin their home. That no man wants a wife who comes home after midnight, covered in someone else's blood. She loved him, so she tried to choose both. But in the end, he made her choose. And when she chose her career, he said she would end up alone. Now, as her face lights up hospital walls across the globe, he watches from a cheap seat in a life she outgrew. My name is Dr. Liana Brooks. There was a time I thought love meant compromise, and that compromise meant choosing between the woman I was meant to be and the wife I was supposed to be. I tried to be both. I tried to make it all work. But in the end, the hardest lesson I learned was that some people will only love you when you stay small. And I was never meant to stay small. This is the story of how I stopped begging for space and started taking it. Of how I gave everything for a man who called my success a threat, until one day, I gave him nothing at all. Liana Brooks had always wanted to be a doctor. Even when she was just a child, she would line up her dolls and pretend to perform heart surgery using a plastic spoon. She watched medical documentaries while other kids were watching cartoons. Her notebooks were filled with messy sketches of organs and long, complicated words she could barely pronounce. But even then, something in her knew. She was born to heal. She was the daughter of a single mother who cleaned hospital floors on the night shift. Liana would sometimes sleep in the hospital break room while her mom mopped blood-stained tiles. Nurses would smile at her, give her juice boxes, and ask, "You want to work here one day?" She would always answer, "I won't just work here, I'll own the room." And she meant it. Years passed, and with every exam, every long night of study, every moment of doubt, she got closer. By the time she was in her second year of med school, she had no social life, barely enough sleep, and textbooks stacked higher than her kitchen counter. But she never complained, because she was building something. And then came Mason. He walked into her life like a scene from a movie, easy smile, warm eyes, confident without being loud. He was everything Liana had never allowed herself to want. He made her laugh. He made her feel soft in a world where she was always sharp. After just a few months, it felt like he knew every part of her, except one. He didn't understand the hunger, the drive to become something no one in her family had ever been, the silent pressure of being the first, the only, the one expected to succeed. At first, he supported her. He brought coffee during her study marathons. He massaged her shoulders when she fell asleep at her desk. He told her she was brilliant, that he believed in her. And maybe he meant it for a while. But somewhere between anatomy lab and night shifts, something shifted. "You're never home," he would say, half joking. "I miss the old you," he whispered one night after she canceled dinner again to prep for rounds. She tried to explain. "This is temporary. Once I'm a full surgeon, things will be different." He just nodded. But the distance had already started to grow. By the time she finished her residency, the cracks had deepened. He proposed. It was not romantic. No rose petals or candlelight. Just a quiet ring box placed on the kitchen table one night as she walked in from a double shift, her scrubs soaked and her brain foggy. "I figured, why wait," he had said. And she said yes. Not because it was perfect, but because she thought she could make it perfect later. They got married in a simple ceremony, no honeymoon. Liana had to be back for early morning rounds. Her first year as a general surgeon was brutal. Surgeries that lasted 10 hours. Patients crashing at 3 a.m. learning how to perform with precision even when her hands were trembling from exhaustion. And Mason grew colder. "You missed my mom's birthday dinner," he snapped one night. "I just removed a tumor the size of a grapefruit from a man's stomach," she said. "That doesn't mean you're excused from being my wife," he shot back. The words sliced deeper than any scalpel. She tried harder. She scheduled lighter shifts when she could, cooked when she had energy, left little notes in his briefcase. But she could feel it. He resented her. Not for what she failed to give, but for what she refused to give up. "I didn't marry a job," he said during one of their worst fights. "I married a woman." She stared at him, breathing heavily. "And I didn't marry a leash," she said quietly. "I married a partner." He went silent. And for a moment, they both knew This marriage was standing on two very different definitions of love. One morning, a few weeks later, she received an email from a medical research team in Switzerland. They were developing a revolutionary approach to minimally invasive heart surgery, and they wanted her to join the team for a one-year fellowship. It was prestigious, competitive,
career-changing.
She waited until dinner to tell him. He barely looked up from his plate. "You already said yes, didn't you?" he muttered. "No," she said honestly. "I wanted to talk to you first."
He put down his fork.
"If you go, I don't know if this marriage survives." She felt like the floor dropped from under her. "I need you here," he continued. "I need a wife, not some globe-trotting surgeon chasing glory." She wanted to scream, to tell him that she had supported his job, his dreams, that she had folded herself small for him so many times she barely recognized her own shape anymore. But instead, she just asked one thing. "If I were a man, would this even be a conversation?" He said nothing. That night, she sat in bed alone, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed with a reminder about the Switzerland Fellowship deadline. It was now or never. She closed her eyes, heart racing, and clicked accept. The next morning, Mason was gone. No goodbye. No note. Just silence. And in that silence, she found her answer. He had never believed in her. Not truly. He believed in the version of her that stayed small, that stayed close, that stayed his. And she was done staying small. The plane touched down in Geneva just as the sun rose over the Alps. Liana sat in her window seat, the sky blushing orange, her breath fogging the glass. Her wedding ring was still on, but her heart no longer clung to the idea of forever. Switzerland was cold, quiet, clean in a way her life had never been. She rented a small, one-bedroom apartment close to the hospital. It had white walls, a tiny balcony, and a single picture of her mother sitting on the nightstand. She unpacked her bags and left her ring in the drawer. From day one, the fellowship was relentless. She worked alongside some of the most brilliant minds in cardiothoracic medicine, people who had pioneered techniques she had only read about in textbooks. For the first time in a long time, Liana was not just working, she was growing. And no one here told her she was too much. No one questioned her hours or asked her to shrink. They challenged her mind, not her value. 3 weeks into the program, she assisted on a rare pediatric case, a newborn with a congenital heart defect. The surgery lasted 12 hours. When it was over, the lead surgeon turned to her and said, "You have hands that save lives." She stood in the scrub room afterward, staring at her reflection in the mirror. No makeup, hair tucked under her surgical cap, dark circles under her eyes, and yet, she felt more beautiful than she ever had. Because she was whole. Mason never called, never emailed. At first, it hurt more than she admitted. She still woke up reaching for her phone. Still caught herself glancing at photos she forgot to delete. Still wondered if she had been selfish. But then, she stopped wondering. One morning, after a groundbreaking procedure, a journalist from a European medical journal asked if he could interview her. She agreed, reluctantly. They met at a quiet cafe. He asked her about technique, about stamina, about what it meant to be a woman in a male-dominated field. Then he asked, "What did you give up to get here?" She hesitated. "I thought I gave up love," she answered honestly. "But now I realize real love would have never asked me to choose." The article went viral in medical circles. Suddenly, Liana was being asked to speak at conferences. She was invited to collaborate on research. She was even approached by a medical tech startup looking to innovate surgical tools designed for women's hands. She started to receive messages from young female med students. "You're the reason I didn't drop out. My boyfriend told me I was too ambitious. I left him. I owe you. I printed your article and taped it to my dorm wall." Liana had once begged for someone to believe in her. Now, she was that someone for thousands. Months passed. Her fellowship ended with honors. She returned to the U.S. not as the wife who left, but as the woman the world now called Dr. Liana Brooks, the heart whisperer. She took a lead position at one of the top hospitals in New York. Her face appeared on the cover of a prominent women's medical magazine. Her inbox flooded with speaking requests, podcast invitations, and offers to write a book. She still lived alone, but her life was full. And then one evening it happened. She was hosting a Q&A at a university where she was guest lecturing. A young woman stood up and asked, "Have you ever been in love?" The room fell quiet. Liana smiled softly.
Yes, she said. Once.
And I'm thankful for it, because it showed me exactly what kind of love I would never accept again. After the event, as she walked to her car, a voice called from behind. "Liana?" She turned. Her heart skipped. It was Mason. He looked older. Tired. A little heavier. He wore a suit that did not quite fit. His eyes searched hers like a man staring into the life he once could have had. "I saw your face in the paper," he said. I almost didn't believe it. Liana stood still, hands in her coat pockets. "I heard you moved to the city," he added. "I've been meaning to reach out." She didn't respond. He took a step closer. "I made a mistake," he said. "Back then. I was afraid. You were becoming something so big and I didn't know how to keep up." She nodded slowly. "I didn't need you to keep up, Mason," she said quietly. "I needed you to walk beside me." Silence. "I still think about you," he said, eyes soft. "I still wonder if there's any chance." Liana looked at him for a long moment. Then she said the truest words she had ever spoken. "I built a life you can't afford to be in." His face froze. "I don't mean money," she continued gently. "I mean courage.
Support. Growth.
I needed a partner. You needed someone who would make themselves smaller so you could feel bigger. I've done that already. I'm done." She turned and walked away. No anger. No drama. Just peace. Because the most powerful revenge was not spite. It was success. Not loud, but undeniable. The city never slept, and neither did Liana's ambition. After the run-in with Mason, she thought she might feel shaken. But instead, she felt lighter, as if the final weight she had carried from her past had been lifted. She had not said it out of spite. She had said it because it was true, and truth had become her closest companion. In the months that followed, her name became synonymous with medical innovation. She was invited to co-lead a cardiac program aimed at increasing access to life-saving surgeries in underserved communities. She began mentoring young female surgeons, particularly women of color, who were often overlooked in the field. She never sought fame, but it found her. One evening, she was invited to a charity gala hosted by the International Women in Medicine Association. Liana did not usually enjoy these events, the photos, the interviews, the surface-level conversations. But this time, they said they were presenting her with an award, the Trailblazer in Medicine honor. She arrived in a long, midnight blue gown, her curls pinned elegantly, a subtle glow on her skin. Cameras flashed as she walked the red carpet. Reporters called her name, asked about her latest medical missions in Ghana, and praised her for starting a new surgical training program for women in war-torn areas. But Liana's mind was somewhere else. She was thinking about a moment years ago, when she stood alone in her bathroom, holding a positive pregnancy test. Back then, she had been a second-year resident, barely surviving on coffee and adrenaline. When she told Mason, he stared at her in silence. "We're not ready," he had said. She agreed. Not because she didn't want the baby, but because she had no room to raise a child with someone who saw her success as a threat. She had lost that baby a few weeks later. Quietly. Alone. She had never told anyone, not even her mother. But now, standing under a chandelier, her name engraved on a golden plaque, she thought of that child. "I did not forget you," she whispered in her heart. "I just needed to become strong enough to protect someone like you." Her speech that night was short. Honest. Raw. "I'm not standing here because I always felt brave," she said. "I'm standing here because I decided to stop apologizing for being bold." Applause erupted. Backstage, a producer from a major documentary studio approached her. "We want to tell your story," she said. "Not just the career, but the climb, the cost, the courage." Liana nodded. She had turned her life into a lighthouse. Now she was ready to let others see how the light was built. The documentary, titled Open Heart: The Life of Dr. Liana Brooks, aired globally within a year. It followed her from the hospital in Geneva to inner-city clinics in the Bronx, from surgical tents in Africa to mentorship circles in Harlem. It also told the truth about her marriage. "I thought choosing myself meant I would lose love forever," she said in the film. "But losing someone who needed me to be less made room for everything I was meant to be." The documentary changed lives. Hospitals saw a rise in female surgical applicants. Medical schools reported increased retention of women in their programs. Messages flooded her inbox again, but now they came from men too. Men who said, "I want to be better for my wife because of you." Men who admitted, "I used to think ambition made women cold. You proved me wrong." And one message came from Mason's mother. She wrote, "I watched your story, and I cried. I wish my son had been man enough to support you. But I'm so proud of the woman you've become. You would have been an amazing daughter-in-law. You're still an amazing woman." Liana stared at that message for a long time. She replied, "Thank you. That means more than you know. I hope he's healing too." She did not need revenge. She needed release. And she had it now. One morning, while doing rounds at the hospital, a young male nurse named Micah stopped her in the hallway. "Dr. Brooks," he said shyly. "Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say thank you." She smiled warmly. "For what?" "You helped my sister. She wanted to quit med school last year. Your documentary changed her mind. Now she wants to go into surgery. Says you make it look like a revolution." Liana laughed. "It is a revolution. One patient at a time." Micah grinned. "She says you're the Beyoncé of medicine." She shook her head, amused. "Tell her Beyoncé's got better dance moves." But later that day, she thought about what he said. Not about Beyoncé, but about revolution. She was leading one, not with signs or speeches, but with scalpel and certainty. With every life she saved, every student she mentored, every young girl who watched her and thought, if she can, maybe I can too. And yet, in all her glory, Liana remained grounded. She still visited her mother every Sunday, still volunteered at free clinics, still took shifts no one wanted, holidays, weekends, the messy hours that taught her humility. Because the moment you forget what you fought for, you risk becoming what you once fought against. That night, back at her apartment, she looked out over the city skyline. She was no longer waiting for someone to come home, no longer wishing for a phone call from the past. Her life was hers, and she had earned every inch of it. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat by the window, and opened a journal. On the first page, she wrote, "I am not too much. I was simply with someone who couldn't carry everything I was born to be." Then she smiled and turned the page. The days began to blend into one another: surgeries, conferences, flights, interviews. Liana's calendar was packed for months in advance, and her name was now not only respected in operating rooms, but whispered with admiration in boardrooms and classrooms alike. She had become more than a surgeon. She was a symbol. But even symbols get tired. One Friday night, after back-to-back procedures and 2 speaking engagements in different cities, Liana walked into her apartment and dropped her bag with a sigh. It was nearly midnight. The lights were dim, the silence deafening. She stood there for a moment in her heels and coat, staring into the space she called home. The apartment was beautiful, sleek, modern, filled with soft lighting and expensive art, but sometimes it still felt empty. She poured herself tea instead of wine that night, wrapped herself in a blanket, and sat on the balcony. The city glittered below. From the 32nd floor, she watched life happen in small lights and distant music. And for the first time in years, she asked herself, what now? She had everything she once dreamed of, but she had no one to share it with. She never regretted choosing her career. Never. But the loneliness was sharp sometimes. Not constant. Just enough to make her pause. Her phone buzzed. It was Zora, her best friend from med school. "Zora, just watched your panel replay. You killed it. Now go to sleep, queen." Liana smiled and replied, "Liana, thanks. Just finished a triple bypass today. Crown's a little tilted but still on. Zora. LOL. Still single? Liana. Why do you ask like you don't already know the answer? Zora. Because I refuse to accept that the hottest woman in Scrubs is still sleeping alone. Liana. Sleeping alone. Living full. Zora sent a heart emoji. But the question lingered. Was she truly living full? Or had she become so good at surviving that she forgot what thriving with someone else could feel like? A week later, while volunteering at a mentoring event for high school girls interested in medicine, she met someone unexpected. His name was Elijah. He was a public health researcher, giving a workshop on urban medical access. He was calm, thoughtful, the kind of man who spoke softly, but carried his words with depth. They ended up on the same panel. She talked about surgery and survival. He talked about prevention and community healing. And for the first time in a long time, Liana found herself leaning forward, not just listening but wanting to listen more. Afterward, he approached her. "You're everything I've heard," he said with a smile. "And more." She raised an eyebrow, playful. "Everything you've heard? I've read your work. Followed your programs. I didn't know you were funny, too." She laughed. A real laugh. One that caught her by surprise. They exchanged numbers. Not romantically, just professionally, at first. But the texts turned into calls. The calls turned into lunches. And slowly, the walls Liana had built, walls she thought were necessary to keep her safe, began to soften. Elijah never once asked her to choose. He admired her hours, her passion, her chaos. "I don't want to interrupt your life," he said one night over dinner. "I just want to be a part of the pages."
It was such a simple statement.
But it broke her wide open.
She realized something.
All this time, she had equated love with sacrifice, with conditions, with compromise that left her empty. But maybe real love was quiet presence. Not a demand, but a space. It was not fast. Liana moved cautiously.
Gently.
And Elijah matched her pace. He never flinched at her early mornings or late nights. He celebrated her when she succeeded and held space for her when she failed. One night, after a rough surgery and a media interview gone sideways, she showed up at his place exhausted and silent. He opened the door, took one look at her, and said nothing. He just pulled her in and held her. She cried into his chest, not because of the stress, but because it had been years since someone made her feel like she did not have to be strong all the time. He whispered, "You don't have to carry it all alone." And for once she believed him. Their relationship stayed private. Liana had no interest in flashing headlines or tabloid romance. She had built her name with integrity, and she protected it fiercely. But those who knew her began to notice the difference. She smiled more, laughed easily, walked a little lighter. One of her residents whispered to another during rounds, "She's in love. You can just tell." And she was. But more than that, she was finally at peace. Months later, at a women's leadership summit, she was asked, "What would you tell the woman you were 10 years ago?" She paused for a long time before answering. "I would tell her that love does not mean shrinking. And anyone who needs you to get smaller to feel big is not love. Love is not a weight. It's a wing." The audience gave her a standing ovation. Afterward, Elijah waited in the wings, smiling. He handed her a water bottle and said, "You're the woman I tell my niece to look up to." Liana kissed him on the cheek and said, "You're the man I tell my past self she deserves." That night, she returned home and opened her journal. On the next page, she wrote, "This time, I didn't have to choose. I just had to wait for someone who never saw me as a threat, only a partner." And that was the difference. The seasons began to change, and with them, so did Liana. The days still began early, pre-sunrise alarms, tight surgical gloves, sterile rooms. But something was different now. She was no longer running on adrenaline and isolation. Her success no longer echoed in a hollow space. It vibrated in a life she was finally building with joy. Elijah had slowly become a steady part of her routine. He never pushed his way in. He simply remained present, At the edges of long days, in quiet dinners eaten on the couch, in shared silence that did not need filling. He did not ask for less of her. He simply gave more of himself. One evening, as they sat together reviewing medical articles, him on healthcare equity, her on a new heart valve prototype, Elijah looked up and said, "You ever think about what your life would look like if you hadn't chosen this path?" Liana didn't hesitate. "I'd still be married." He raised an eyebrow. She smiled wryly. "But I wouldn't be happy." He nodded slowly, understanding. Then she added, "I might have had a house in the suburbs and Sunday brunches, but I'd also have a hollow feeling every time I looked in the mirror." Elijah reached for her hand. "And now?" She looked at their hands, dark fingers laced together, two lives that had known pain finding ease. "Now, I see someone I fought hard to become," she said. "Someone who didn't walk away from love." She walked toward herself. That night, she finally took the ring box from the back of her drawer, the one that held her old wedding ring. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She walked to the balcony, opened the box, and held the ring in her palm one last time. It had once represented love. Now, it only reminded her of silence, of boundaries crossed, of apologies never made. She kissed it gently, then dropped it. It fell like a quiet truth, lost in the wind, free. She turned and went back inside. From that day forward, her past no longer lived with her. Around this time, her memoir, Scalpel and Soul, was picked up by a major publishing house. It was a raw, intimate look at her life, from childhood poverty to med school trauma, to marriage and the choice that redefined everything. The tagline read, "The cost of becoming is nothing compared to the cost of staying small." Pre-orders sold out in days. She went on a short press tour, and everywhere she spoke, the room overflowed, young women, single mothers, aspiring surgeons, and even middle-aged women who had once walked away from their dreams too quietly. One interviewer asked, "Was there ever a moment when you thought of going back? Of choosing your marriage over your career?" Liana's response was firm. "I didn't choose my career over my marriage. I chose my career because my marriage didn't include room for me." He gave me an ultimatum, and I gave him an exit. The clip went viral. It wasn't meant to be a dig. It was simply the truth. Later, during a stop at a women's leadership event in Chicago, she was presented with the Global Voice for Women in Medicine Award. When she took the stage, she paused for a long moment before speaking. "I want to dedicate this to every woman who's ever been asked to choose," she began. "Between being soft and being strong. Between being loved and being respected. Between being present in someone else's life or showing up for her own." She scanned the audience, some standing already. "You were never too much. You were just in the wrong room." The crowd erupted. After the ceremony, she was approached by a small group of young interns, one of them nearly in tears. "I was going to drop out," the girl said. "My boyfriend said I was too intense, too focused. Watching your journey saved mine." Liana hugged her without hesitation. "This life is heavy," she whispered, "but you don't have to carry it alone. Just don't ever hand your worth to someone who doesn't know how to hold it." A few days later, Liana returned home to find a letter in her mailbox. It had no return address. Inside, just a card. No name. No message. Only 4 words. "You were right. Always." She didn't need a signature. She knew it was from Mason. She sat down for a moment holding the card, and she realized she felt nothing. Not anger. Not pride. Not sadness. Just peace. Because once upon a time, she would have clung to those 4 words, waited for them, begged for them, built hope around them. Now they meant closure. Nothing more. She placed the card into a folder labeled "Letters I Never Answered" and tucked it away. She was done rewriting chapters that were already finished. That weekend, she and Elijah took a trip to a quiet lake house upstate. They didn't talk about surgery. They didn't talk about the past. They walked barefoot on the dock, made pancakes together, slept in past sunrise. And as they lay in a hammock, arms intertwined, Elijah whispered, "Do you ever wish you'd met me first?" She smiled, eyes closed against his chest.
No, she said.
If I had, I might not have become this version of me. I had to lose everything that wasn't love to recognize the real thing when it finally showed up. Elijah kissed her forehead. I'm glad you waited. I wasn't waiting, she replied softly. I was healing. And now she was whole. The sun rose gently over the lake house as birds sang, and the breeze rustled the trees. Liana sat on the wooden deck with her knees pulled to her chest, a hot mug of tea in her hand, and the quiet warmth of Elijah still lingering in the sheets behind her. She breathed in the scent of morning and stillness, something she had once feared, now something she craved. It was strange how full her life felt in these quiet moments. She had built a reputation that stretched across continents. Her name was taught in medical schools. Her lectures were translated into 5 languages. Yet here, wrapped in a sweater and bare feet, she was simply Liana. And that was enough. She looked at the message on her phone again, an invitation from the World Health Leadership Forum. They wanted her to deliver the opening keynote in Geneva, where she had once stood as a young fellow, still nursing heartbreak and ambition at war. This time, they wanted her as the face of the future.
She said yes.
And then she smiled to herself because there had been a time when saying yes to herself meant saying goodbye to everyone else. Not anymore. She turned around to find Elijah standing in the doorway, hair still tousled from sleep, holding a second mug of tea. You always wake up this early? He asked, yawning. Only when life feels this good, she said with a grin. They sat together as the lake sparkled in the distance. He looked over at her. Do you ever think about starting something new? Not work-related. Just for you? Liana tilted her head. Like what? I don't know, he shrugged. You've done so much for the world. What would you do if you were just living for yourself? That question settled into her bones. It echoed for days after they returned to the city. And then, one afternoon, while scrolling through photos from her early residency days, photos of her and other young women of color, tired but proud, she had an idea. She opened a blank document and typed a title, The Athena Initiative, Rebuilding Medicine with Women at the Center. It would be a non-profit, not just scholarships, but full mentorship pipelines, shadowing opportunities, mental health support for medical students, leadership programs for women in medicine who felt isolated, unsupported, or silenced. Not just for surgeons. For anyone who had been told, you're too ambitious. She pitched it to a few colleagues. They pledged support within minutes. One donor from her hospital offered $250,000 before the first fundraiser. It launched quietly. No big press releases. No flashing headlines. But it took off like wildfire. Within 6 months, they had over 200 applications. Within a year, they had 3 chapters globally, in Brazil, India, and Kenya. Liana stepped down from a few of her hospital commitments, not to slow down, but to create space. She had spent years building herself. Now she was building something for others to grow inside. In an interview with a global health podcast, the host asked her, how do you know when it's time to let go of the things that once defined you? Liana thought for a moment. Because you stop fearing the silence, she said. You stop needing the applause. And you start creating from peace, not from pain. The clip was shared widely, again. But this time, the most unexpected thing happened. A young woman, barely 22, posted a video reaction, holding up Liana's memoir. She said, I watched my mother give up medicine to raise me because my father told her she couldn't do both. She spent years bitter and empty. I promised myself I'd break that cycle. And when I was ready to drop out of med school, I read this book. Dr. Liana Brooks didn't just change her life. She saved mine. Liana watched that video in her office, her eyes burning. Because sometimes, success feels like a quiet trophy on a shelf. But real impact? It sounds like someone saying, you made me believe in myself again. One night, Elijah invited her to dinner, just the 2 of them, nothing fancy. But when she arrived, the small restaurant was closed to the public. Candles lit the tables. Soft music played in the background. And he stood there, nervously adjusting his blazer. I know you never needed saving, he said as she walked in. I know you're the strongest person in every room, but if you ever want someone to walk beside you for real, I'd be honored." Then he pulled out a small box. Her breath caught. Inside was not a diamond. It was a delicate gold band, engraved on the inside with 5 small words. No shrinking, just rising together. Tears welled in her eyes. He slipped it onto her finger and said, "This is not a promise to complete you. You're already whole. This is just an invitation to keep growing. With me." Liana nodded, laughing through her tears. "Yes," she whispered, not because she needed him, but because she wanted him. That night, she returned home, stood in front of her mirror, and stared at the reflection of a woman she had once thought she had to compromise to be loved. Now she was loved because she never compromised. Her strength did not drive him away. It drew him in. Her ambition was not an obstacle. It was admired. And this time, she wasn't shrinking to fit inside someone else's version of love. She was expanding. Together. The wedding was nothing like her first. No hurried vows. No half-hearted smiles. No guests she barely knew. This time it was intimate. Intentional. Soft in the ways that mattered. They held it in the hospital garden where Liana had performed her first solo surgery. Beneath a canopy of twinkling lights, surrounded by close friends, men's colleagues, and her mother, whose eyes shined with joy so deep it cracked open the strongest hearts. Elijah waited at the end of the aisle, not as a man asking her to change, but as one who had fallen in love with everything she already was. As she walked down the aisle, there were no tears of fear, no flashes of doubt, just breath, just peace. When she reached him, he whispered, "You're everything they said a woman shouldn't be. And that's exactly why you're everything to me." The officiant smiled. "Do you take her brilliance, scars, and all?" Elijah nodded. "I do. Every piece." And when Liana said, "I do," she wasn't just marrying him. She was marrying her future. Unapologetically, joyfully, and freely. After the ceremony, they danced under the stars. No speeches. No press. Just 2 people who had learned that love should never ask you to dim your light. In the weeks that followed, life continued in its full rhythm. Liana returned to the Or with her usual focus and fire. She finalized the expansion of the Athena initiative into Southeast Asia. She was asked to give the commencement speech at her old medical school, an invitation she once dreamed of in secret. She wore a tailored white suit that day, her natural curls framing her face, a soft gold pin at her collar that read, "Still rising." As she took the podium, the room full of graduating doctors rose to their feet in thunderous applause. She waited for silence. Then she began. "I was told once that ambition would ruin me, that my drive would be the end of my marriage, that no man would ever stay with a woman who prioritized saving lives over baking pies." The crowd chuckled gently. She smiled. And maybe that was true for someone who didn't deserve me. The room went still. "But what I've learned," she continued, "is that any love that demands you stay small is not love. It's fear. And fear makes poor company." She looked into the sea of hopeful faces, many of them women, many of them already learning to juggle expectations and identity. "So here's my advice," she said. "Be loud. Be brilliant. Be inconvenient. Be all the things they told you would make you unlovable. Because the right people won't just stay, they'll stand beside you." Standing ovation. Afterward, a young woman approached her in the hallway. She was trembling slightly. "Dr. Brooks, my name is Ava. My fiancé left me when I matched into surgical residency. Said I chose career over love." Liana placed a hand gently on her shoulder.
"No.
You chose yourself over sacrifice that wasn't mutual." Ava nodded, blinking back tears. "How do I know I'll be okay?" Liana didn't hesitate. "Because one day," she said, "you'll stop trying to be enough for someone who doesn't even know what enough looks like. And you'll realize you already are." As the years passed, Liana continued to build not just institutions but impact. She and Elijah traveled to rural hospitals, started a mobile training unit, adopted a little girl from South Africa whose heart surgery Liana had performed herself. They named her Hope. And in that small child's laugh, Liana heard something that once seemed impossible. The echo of a life that was never meant to be quiet. Hope grew up with a mother who wore scrubs like armor and heels like a crown. A mother who never once apologized for being both nurturing and fierce. And on Hope's 10th birthday, Liana handed her a wrapped gift. Inside was a stethoscope. Not because she expected her daughter to become a doctor, but because she wanted her to know. Your hands can heal if you choose. Your voice can lead if you let it. And your dreams? They are not negotiable. That night, after the cake and candles, Liana sat on the porch, watching Hope chase fireflies in the dark yard. Elijah beside her. He rested his head against hers and whispered, "I'm proud of the life you've built." Liana looked out over the quiet land. "It wasn't just for me," she said. "It was for every woman who never got to finish her story." He nodded, holding her hand. "And now," she smiled, "now, I teach them to write new ones." She was told that ambition and love could not live in the same house, that she had to choose.
She did.
And now, the world knows her name, not because she chose fame, but because she chose herself. Speech balloon, which part of Liana's story hit home for you? Tell us in the comments. Thumbs up like this video if it moved you. Bell subscribe for more powerful true stories of women who rise.